If any of you can remember back to the early episodes of this podcast, that was the little montage of sounds that I used to use at the start of each episode. They've now been replaced by this, which kind of does the trick. Perhaps this episode, however, should start with this. That's me slamming the door behind me and locking it, probably from the inside. Welcome to this self-isolation episode of the Cycling Europe podcast. It's number 16, by the way, and it's a rather special episode. The acknowledgement section of my first book, Crossing Europe, contains the following paragraph. And finally, many thanks to the man who has been the inspiration for many small-time cycling adventures, such as this particular jaunt across Europe, long-distance cycling guru Mark Beaumont. May you live long, continue to do lots of cycling, and prosper. That was written in August 2011, a year after my own cycle from southern England to southern Italy, that I wrote about in the book. The reason I included the acknowledgement to Mark was because, shortly after I came up with the idea of that first cycle across the continent, his documentary, The Man Who Cycled the World, appeared on the TV. It was all about his first cycle around the globe in 2007 and 2008, and for me, it was inspirational.
One man, one bike, one dream, to be the fastest man around the world. To smash the record, Mark Beaumont must cycle 18,000 miles in just 200 days. His epic journey will take him through floods, burning deserts, freezing winds, and desolate plains. The experience will push bike, body, and soul to the limit.
I feel incredibly weak. I don't know what to do.
It's the ultimate endurance test. If he pulls it off, the world record will be his.
Well, this is it. This is halfway around.
I subsequently went to listen to Mark give a talk in Woking of all places, and we have, over the past 10 years, exchanged occasional emails. But I've never spoken to the man, until now that is. I invited him onto the podcast, and much to his credit, he emailed back almost immediately to say yes. Here it comes. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me along. We've been in touch over the years, but we've never actually spoken.
Yeah, we have. In fact, the last time I saw you, I waved at you from the road. It was in Wales. I'd just climbed Cadair Idris. This is a really bizarre tale. And there was a guy who was following me in a kind of a 4x4 car. And I kept looking through the mirror and I kept thinking, that looks like Mark Beaumont. And anyway, I got horribly lost in my car. And I stopped at the corner of a junction. And it was deserted in the middle of these mountains in Wales. And then you drove past, and it said on the side of your car, it said something like Mark Beaumont, whatever expedition you were doing at the time, and you were on a speaking tour.
That's right.
And I looked up, and you'd been speaking, I think, the previous night on the Welsh coast.
That's right. It's hilarious. My wife absolutely hates the fact that my van has my name down the side of it, because you can imagine you stop at traffic lights, you stop in town, and even whether people know who Mark Beaumont is or not, the fact that it's got your name at the side, people then look to see who Mark Beaumont is and give you a wave. So yes, I don't mind it. I've got used to it, but it allows you to call it a work van. But you can imagine Nikki, my wife, is not such a fan.
Well, yeah, it was kind of a bizarre experience because I thought, what are the chances of me being followed by Mark Beaumont in the middle of the Welsh mountains? But you were a very patient driver. I was terrified you were going to overtake at some point. And but anyway, in this period of isolation, in this period of self-isolation, are you managing to keep fit and keeping up in terms of the cycling and generally keeping active?
Yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who makes my almost entire work and passion out of travel and events. So it's, of course, had a fundamental impact on everything I do. But equally, I'm probably somebody who's better equipped than most with time in isolation. I've spent a huge amount of time doing expeditions on my own. And also, I was a homeschooled boy. I lived on the farm for the first 12 years of my life. So having my two daughters, aged 6 and 3, at home, and my wife, who is a teacher, homeschooling them, I realised that we're in quite a lucky situation because, I kind of know what that's all about, and I'm not too worried about it, and they're not at the exam years yet. So fundamentally, like all of us, it's having a profound effect on my income and my livelihood. But actually, as a family, we're in a pretty good place.
Yeah, because actually I was supposed to come and listen to you talk at an event in Tadcaster, which obviously had been cancelled. Have you had a lot of speaking engagements cancelled recently?
Yeah, a huge amount. I spend a lot of my time doing public events and a lot of my time doing corporate events, business events. I do a lot of consultancy work. I always joke that I spend half my life in a suit and half my life in lycra. People on social media only know me for the lycra side of my life, but yeah, it's all kind of not happening. But that event in Tadcaster, I was really looking forward to. That's my friends down at Cycle Sense, fantastic independent bike store, family-run place, which I'm sure a lot of listeners will have heard of and supported before. And they run some brilliant events out of the pub next door, basically, which the son of the owner runs. So we'll make it happen again. I've spoken there before, and it's a great community event when it does happen.
Well, yeah, because David, who runs Cycle Sense, I bought my new bike. I bought a fantastic Koga touring bike last year, and when I bought it, he said to me, "Oh, we're hoping to get Mark Beaumont down here." So I was delighted to see that you were coming down. But hey, then kind of events happen, and it hasn't happened yet. But I'm sure it will at some point.
Yeah, Dave and his sons, run a fantastic setup there, and the events they put on are worth supporting. The network we have of independent bike stores in the UK is well worth looking after, because that knowledge that they've got, you simply can't get from buying online. I mean, you went there and bought yourself a nice Koga, and I rode those bikes for 12 years on all my major expeditions. Small company, Dutch, really sort of caring about the details and specializing in trekking and touring and all the things that we do. So, these brands need that individual touch, don't they? To really understand what you're getting, because they're big investments, especially if you're planning to cycle across Europe and around the world and do the big trips.
To give a little advert for Koga for a few moments, I have to say my bike is just phenomenal. It's a fantastic bike, and even if I don't ride it for a few weeks, I just go out on it and it's almost as if it's just been serviced. It's a beautiful thing to cycle with a roll-off hub and the carbon belt. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. Still not too many of them on British roads. I worked with that team for 12 years doing product development with them. The only reason I stepped away from working with Koga is the fact that they were so focused on trekking and e-bikes, and I was needing other stuff. I was needing time trial bikes, like road race bikes, like the range which they weren't developing quite so much. And I also do a lot of filming for Global Cycling Network, for GCN. So, naturally, when I'm doing different shoots, I'm just back from a big film shoot in Chile, I need to be jumping on different bikes and trying different things. So, it just got to the point in my career where it didn't make sense to just be working with one company. But those guys, I worked with for a very long time. It was funny, actually, because last week I was getting the train out of Waverley Station in the middle of Edinburgh, where I live, and I locked the bike up with my town bike, similarly a belt drive Koga, and then got on the train down south. And then a few days later, I thought, well, I'll run back to the station and bring the bike home. And by the time I ran to the station, the pocket I'd locked the key in had somehow fallen open, and I'd lost the key. So I was left with that slightly awkward situation where I had this beautiful bike locked up at the station and no way to get it. Filmed it, but there was a wonderful picture of me burgling my own bike yesterday morning with the kind chap from Network Rail. I considering what's happening in the UK right now, they must have bigger things to worry about. But there I was with these massive 22-inch wire cutters trying to burgle my own bike to get it home. But at least I could prove it was mine, because there's not many Kogas on the road.
I hope somebody took that photo. That would make a fantastic photo. Mark Beaumont steals bike in Edinburgh. Fantastic.
I'm sure there's a few security cameras in the Waverley Station, but I got my bike home, which is a good thing.
Can I take you back to 2008 and your first journey around the world when you broke the record for a unsupported trip around the globe. That was in 2008. What was your motivation for doing that in the first place?
Well, I mean, at the time, I was 22 years old. I just left university, just left Glasgow University. I had an economics and politics degree, and I planned to have a sort of a corporate job. I planned to work in finance, be an accountant. I had no reference point or ambition to, do what I've done in the last, nearly 15 years. I didn't think you could make a job out of traveling and making documentaries and all the things I've gone on to do. I simply at that point thought, let's go on the biggest trip that I can imagine just to get it out my system. It was like a post-university gap year. And I thought, well, if I've only got one chance, let's pedal around the planet. When I researched those who had cycled around the world, I sort of got intrigued about the concept of a proper circumnavigation because, to cycle around the world, you could just stick to the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, take when Ewan McGregor and Charlie Boorman did Long Way Round. They didn't do a circumnavigation. They did an around the world. They just stayed in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, take that to its extreme and you could just, pedal around the flag at the North Pole and you've gone around the world. But to do a proper circumnavigation, you have to hit 2 points on the opposite side of the planet. You have to go more than 18,000 miles. You have to never go back on yourself. There's rules. There's very specific things which make a circumnavigation a thing rather than just an around the world journey. And then I sort of thought, well, I've never raced. I've never been coached. I'm certainly not, a fast club rider. I didn't rate myself as a professional athlete. I just thought, well, I'll look at the world record because, in my teenage years, I'd watched Ellen MacArthur sailing around the world and smashing that, solo non-stop sailing record. And I thought, well, let's find out who's best in class. Like, what's the equivalent in the cycling world? And I had just thought it would be the most iconic professional, record out there in cycling. It's the world. And yet, back then in 2005, 2006, when I started looking at it, the record stood at 276 days to get around the planet. And I suddenly realized, hang on a second, this hasn't been done properly. Like, it wasn't me thinking I was a professional bike rider. It was more of a feat of enterprise going, why is that record so slow? I don't mean to be unkind about anyone who has cycled around the planet, but 276 is not quick, not if you do the maths. So, I suddenly realized, hang on a second, I could break a record here. And from as soon as that thought occurred, and I set out, with a very simple plan, let's ride 100 miles a day around the planet. Riding a century a day is no big deal for a lot of good riders. And that became a big thing. I made a BBC documentary series and it launched my career, but it was a very simple idea.
So the idea of cycling around the world as a record attempt, it actually existed before you did it. Did the rules exist as well? The 18,000 miles, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so absolutely. It hadn't been tried that many times. In fact, the rules had changed a few times and then become quite standardized. So all land-based circumnavigations, whether you drive it, motorbike it, run it, is all 18,000 miles. Back in the day, so back in the 70s and 80s, the circumnavigation world record didn't used to have the same strict rules about 2 points on the opposite side of the world, blah, blah, blah. So when Nick Crane and a few other riders did it back in, we're going back 20, 30 years now, they did shorter distances. The 18,000 miles is only sort of happened and become standardized in the last 15 years. But only a handful of people had gone for it by those modern standards. And in the last sort of 13, 14 years, the rules have only changed very slightly. So they went from sort of being formulated and sort of the rules that I went for first time around to then only changing a very little between the first time and the second time I cycled around the world. The main difference in the decade between the two times that I cycled around the world is it used to be that the clock stopped every time you got to the end of a continent because they deemed it a bike race. So it was purely the time on the bike that was timed. But then about 6-7 years ago, somebody slightly took advantage of that rule and basically took recovery time after each continent. So their total time around the planet was very different to their ride time. And Guinness World Records looked at that and said, that's not within the spirit of what we meant. New rule, the clock never stops. And that's actually made it quite interesting in the last couple of years, because now all your flights, any contingency, absolutely everything is within that time. And considering the record to get around the planet is now 78 days, that becomes pretty tough. You've now got to factor in everything that happens both on the bike and off the bike to break the record.
Am I right in thinking you are the person who holds that record, that 78 days?
Yes, yeah. So I'd watched with sort of awe and interest. When I first broke the record in 2007, 2008, that went from 5 people having ever gone for it to multiple people every year going for it. I can't take all the credit for that, but I did film a big BBC One documentary series. It suddenly became a recognised event. A lot of people started going for it, and I've watched the guys and the girls in the last 12, 13 years. It's just fantastic. The generation that we live in terms of endurance bike riding, and it come down markedly over those years in time. But the big evolution really is the fact that it's gone from an unsupported record, where really it's as much about what happens off the bike as on the bike. Where's your next meal? Where are you going to sleep each night? To a fully supported race. You might as well be a Tour de France rider now. It's no longer about the people and the cultures and the places. It's just about get your head down and race as far as you can every day. So it's the same record in terms of the rules, roughly, but it's a totally different experience now. Having done it both, it's hard to even compare the two. I'm sure you can appreciate that, having done all your amazing touring trips. If you've got a support truck with you and company and your job is just to ride miles rather than actually meet people, it's a totally different experience.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that actually, because are there 2 distinct records, an unsupported one and a supported one, or is it just all one now?
It's the same thing, and it's always been the same thing. So Guinness World Record, quite rightly in my opinion, have always said, how do you differentiate? It's a sliding scale. If you send spare tires and a spare chain down the road to yourself, or get somebody to pop up and take a care package for you, or even stopping at people's houses, or the amount that you're allowed to buy kit and supplies along the way, at what level does that become supported? So it's not a binary thing whether you're supported or not. It's not like when you're rowing an ocean where you're very clearly on your own, nobody comes close to you. You're in a closed off world. It's entirely up to your physicality and mentality to get through that journey. Cycling, you're so connected to the world around you. So many of the journeys over the years had become quite supported, you could say. People were popping up along the route. You were carrying less and less on the bike. There was, greater degrees of support. But, ultimately, this is not a record for how quickly you can pitch your tent and find your next meal. It's a record for how quickly you can race your bike around the planet. So, Guinness World Records say we're not going to judge that bit of it. We are purely judging you on how fast you can ride your bike around the planet. Interestingly, I broke the Africa World Record, Cairo to Cape Town, which is a 6,000-mile route a number of years ago. And very soon after, a group of riders went and did that faster. But they did it literally as a team time trial with a support truck with them fully supported. So Guinness World Record do differentiate between multiple riders and solo riders. So the team and solo aspect is important. But the fact that they were supported and I wasn't supported, doesn't matter in their eyes. It's all the same thing. So, you and I both know it's almost impossible to go as fast if you don't have somebody, if you've got somebody carrying your kit and fully supporting you. So the fact that I've now gone around the planet with an amazing support team, a performance manager, a mechanic, the full works, it's almost impossible to now break that record fully unsupported.
Yeah. Well, I can't imagine how anybody, because you were, how many kilometres were you doing per day? 230, 40, something like that?
That's miles. I
Miles?
was so two,
Goodness.
so I was averaging 240 miles a day. So I was averaging, well, that's 385 kilometers average a day. So yeah, I mean, to make that your average, I was regularly, knocking out 400k days, and you're doing that every single day for 2.5 months. And the discipline around that is incredible. If you add it up, it was 75 days of riding, 3 days flights, 2 days contingency. So for every continent, there was four continents I was racing across. There was 12 hours of contingency. Now, if you imagine you're on your own, you've done a lot of these big trips, you can lose 12 hours so easily just by trying to figure out where you're going to stay each night, or waiting for somebody to cook your next meal, or, waiting for a flight delays or schedules. So to have that dialed to the degree where you can go 18,000 miles, and basically you're on the bike from 4 o'clock in the morning till 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. You're sleeping for 5 hours, and then you're back on the bike. You can't do that when you're on your own. I would actually argue that it would get pretty unsafe, because you're so sleep deprived. You need a team around you to look after your well-being, your safety, as much as anything else.
Yeah. I mean, just to put it into some kind of context, you're talking about cycling every day from probably London to Newcastle on the M1, that kind of distance.
Yeah.
Which is phenomenal.
You can get from my house in Edinburgh into Wales.
Yeah.
So Edinburgh, just across the Welsh border, every single day for 2.5 months.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't drive those sorts of distances. So unless you're a bike rider, it's hard to compute what that is. And I mean, a trained bike rider might be able to do that once or twice, but to be able to sustain that every day for 2.5 months, that's the bit you've got to work up to. And that's where you've got to have an amazing team. I always give credit to the performance and logistics team, because, the first time I cycled around the world, I had my mum at home at the kitchen table, looking at maps, phoning the British Embassy, the flight companies, just doing some basic logistics. The second time, there was 40 people involved in that. It was a global project which took 2.5 years. So it looks like one guy, riding his bike 16 hours a day, but that doesn't even get close to the reality to make that a success.
The longest I've ever done in one day was when I cycled around the Mediterranean, and I cycled from just south of Barcelona to Valencia in one day. It was pancake flat. It was a beautiful day. There was no wind whatsoever. And when I got to Valencia, I just literally collapsed. But the thought of doing that, even, in fact, probably doing sometimes twice as long as that over such a long period of time, I take my hat off to you. It's a phenomenal achievement. But anyway, going back to the 2008 time that you went around the world, this is the one where you were unsupported.
Yes.
Did you have kind of preconceptions as to what that might be like, and what was the reality like compared to the preconceptions?
I think my preconceptions were very much about the bike ride. I mean, I'm sure you can relate to this. You spend your time beforehand worrying about, have I packed the right things? Am I fit enough? Am I ready for the ride? You purely think about the physical aspect of what that is, and like the journey aspect of, your cook stove and your tent and the rest of it. The reality is, once you get out there, it is about the people, the places, the cultures, the excitement of the unknown. I'll always remember pedaling out of Europe. I did the first 3 weeks heading down to Istanbul, and then headed into the unknown, into Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, India, just excited. But, I was so naive at that point. I was early 20s. I'd never been outside of Europe and North America. I didn't know what to expect. I then soon found myself, in Iran, sleeping in mosques each night or under the road, and heading around Pakistan on the Afghan border under armed escort for, a really tough stretch through the Baluchi desert, and just having to trust people and find my way, and, just being so out of my comfort zone. So the journey before I left was very much about the practicalities of riding the bike. The journey that I found, the bike was just a vehicle to get between interesting places. And the book that I wrote and the film that I made was very much about that sort of slideshow view of the world, and my sort of fascination. So I'd convinced BBC Scotland to give me a camera, and they said, look, if you do well, if you manage to capture this journey, we'll make a half-hour documentary out of it. So I was going to be out there for half a year and riding 100 miles a day, and it was going to become a half-hour dog. By the time I did a good job of that, they did make more of it. But still, that was the humble beginnings. But I would sit in my tent at the end of days and often just chat to that camera at arm's length for half an hour, because it was my company on the road. That was sort of my buddy, my Wilson, if you like. So for me, it was just on my own for half a year with a camera. This was before social media. There was no Twitter, there was no Instagram, there was no Facebook. We're talking about, nearly 15 years ago now. I was out there 2007, 2008 when I finished. And it was just a proper sort of journey of discovery. I absolutely loved it. I'm often asked to compare all my trips. And in the last 15 years, I've filmed and traveled through about 130 countries. You'll never replicate the raw emotion and wonder of the first time you go on a journey like that. Not because the world changes that much, but because you change. You change as a person. And if I was to compare the 2 times pedaling around the planet, the first one was a much better adventure in the true sense of the word. I absolutely loved it. I actually got to go back recently and record the audiobook, and keep in mind, I wrote that book, well over 10 years ago. And I was sort of laughing aloud because there was stuff which I'd completely forgotten. But there was also sentiments which, I probably wouldn't say aloud anymore, not least because I'm a married man and, I've got, I'm at a different point in my life, but also because you just don't see the world the same as those first years when you've just left university and you're just trying to figure out things for the first time. So I think it's always precious the first time you go on a big expedition or a big bike journey like that, because, all I'm trying to say is, you get tied up and worried about the physical aspects of a journey, but really it's about getting the arrows pointing the other way and the world that you're passing through.
Did you find it frustrating that you were, from the outset, doing it against the clock? And although it did take you 194 days, 17 hours, did you ever feel as though, I just want to spend a little bit more time here, I want to slow down, I want to take a day off, I want to go and explore this, I want to go and have a look at that particular place, I want to spend more time with these people? Was that a big frustration?
Honestly, no. I've never been competitive insofar as I've never raced, but I've always sort of pushed myself. I think I'd make a really poor nomadic traveler if I just sort of went out there and could literally go whichever way the wind blows or whichever way just turn left or right at the next junction. I wouldn't be very good at that. I often joke with friends of mine who have done that well, like Al Humphreys and Rob Lilwell. The idea of spending 3-4 years cycling around the world, I've got so much respect for, but it's not me. It's not the way I'm wired up. So I love that sense of purpose. I love that sense of momentum that you create when you're trying to cover big miles, and you get to the middle of every afternoon and you go, right, where am I gonna pitch my tent tonight? How far am I gonna get? What the logistics around keeping fueled and just the simple routines on these big expeditions. I think I'd get quite lonely if I was just sort of nomadically traveling. I've spent a huge amount of time in my own head, but I'm always sort of preoccupied by the intensity that I've sort of, I guess, falsely created for myself. And you need people, you need the friendship of strangers, as you pass through the world. So the honest answer is no. I think people often sort of jokingly criticize my journeys and say, don't you think you're missing the point because you're going so damn fast? But I don't think there is a speed you can go at when you're not tuned into the world around you. I think that's the wonderful thing about life on two wheels. You do sense it all. And I think that intensity that you create when you're trying to break a record, you have such amazing meetings with people, and when you explain what you're doing, and people really buy into that. So no, I've always found that the record breaking element brings a wonderful sort of purpose and intensity to it. But there's no right or wrong way to ride your bike. Just ride your bike. But it's an element I've always enjoyed.
I would imagine you get contacted all the time by people who are looking for advice, inspiration, who are embarking on a trip around the world, whether it be against the clock or just simply because they're wanting to go off on their bike around the world. What key bits of advice do you give them about that journey?
I know through experience that most of these trips don't get to the start line. You know, most people are good at the bike riding bit, but giving yourself the time, the finances, the freedom to actually take on these journeys is hard. You know, all the complementary skill sets to actually, because you know, people doubt you, people, loved ones who are close to you, you know, worry for you, and you know, often it takes real strength, it takes real confidence to see these ideas through to fruition. So, you know, I always say to people, the hardest bit, it's a cliche, is getting started, is having the gumption to see through your ideas. And you know, especially, you know, people always think that your detractors are the people who you don't get on with, but I often think that actually the people you need to have the love and support from your friends and your family when you're taking on journeys and expeditions. But you also need to realize that you're going to be managing their fears, their expectations, their insecurities as you set out on whatever journey is important to you. And it's really, really important to understand before you set out, because you've got to face all of that before you start turning the pedals. You know, you've got to manage expectations. You've got to have that emotional leadership. You've got to fundraise. You've got to do the practical parts before you give yourself the time to turn the pedals and set off around the planet, or whatever it is. So I'm very happy to always impart practical advice, but it normally boils down to the grit, the resolve to actually see your plans through.
Yeah, no, I think that is good, solid advice. Have you been watching recently the new series of Race Around the World?
No, I've not. Tell me more.
Because I didn't watch the first series, but it consists of these couples who head off. I think the first series they went from Britain to Singapore, and they're racing each other around the world. It's a documentary on BBC Two
I did see one of them. You're absolutely right. I saw the first one when they set out from Greenwich, and they're given the equivalent money of a flight to Singapore, which I think was £1,200, and then they could work along the way. Yes, I saw the very first one.
Well, there's a new series, and it's I didn't watch the first series, but I've started watching this one, and they're going from Mexico down to Ushuaia, although it's quite comical at the beginning because none of them can pronounce Ushuaia. Now,
I've cycled that.
Well, exactly. That's it's a pity you're not watching it, because I think that will presumably bring back a lot of memories of that second trip that you did. How was that compared to that first one? Because for that second one, you weren't doing it against the clock, were you? It was more of a physical challenge rather than anything else.
Yeah, so the idea with the Americas was to, I mean, the first series, The Man Who Cycled the World, had been such a success for the BBC. I should point out, for the BBC, because I didn't get paid a penny to do it. But you know, it was the way I launched my career, and I was very grateful for the opportunity to go and, you know, do more and ride my bike. So, you know, with the Americas, it was them that came back to me and said, right, forget all that sponsorship malarkey. This time, you know, this is a BBC project. Where do you want to ride your bike? So we set off on the Americas, and the mission was to climb the high peaks of North and South America. You got Denali in Alaska and Aconcagua in Argentina, and it's basically 13,000 miles of pedaling from top to toe. So you've got this wonderful spine of the Americas, the Cordillera, and it was all about exploring that. So the only time pressure really came between getting between the mountains within a single climbing season. So there was a little bit of time pressure there, but I could average about 70 miles a day, and I would often do a lot more than that. So I would then stack up days where I could take a day or two off and go off and film other stories, be it ranching in Montana or, you know, amazing festivals in Mexico, or, you know, just meeting remarkable people along the way. And yeah, it was 9 months of mountaineering and cycling. I loved it because, to your point, there was a purpose, there was a real timeline, but there was a lot more time to meet people and soak up stories.
Yeah, I think you should catch those programs on BBC Two. I think they're on a Sunday night, and they're entertaining, but they're actually beautiful travelogues as well. And
Yeah.
every time I've been watching them, I keep thinking of the programs that you made. And
Would you be allowed to? So, if you were given that budget in Mexico, could you do that? Could you just go to a bike shop, hire a bike, and start cycling? Would that win the show, or is that too obvious?
I don't know. Good question. Good question. I don't know. I might apply next year. That is I hadn't thought about that, because you're right. They're given the airfare, so they're given about $1,500 each, I think.
It'd be quite hard to get all the way. I mean, that stretch took me a good 4 months. You could go quicker. I know Dean Stotts, and a few other guys who have gone for the Americas record from top to toe. So the Pan Americas is the longest continuous road in the world, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, and it finishes at Ushuaia. It's a wonderful place to finish an expedition. You finish on this little pebble beach just outside Ushuaia, where the boats leave to go down to Antarctica. You've got Drake Passage in front of you, that 500-mile stretch across to Antarctica, and it properly feels like the end of the world, which is what the sign says as well.
How did you get across the Darien Gap?
So at that time, the BBC high risk team were very worried about Colombia. I wasn't so worried about it, because, I think your risk profile as a bike rider is very different than being a journalist. But, they were mainly working with journalists in the field, and their advice at the time was that I couldn't travel through Colombia. So you've got Panama on the north of the Darien Gap, and then you've got Colombia on the south. And, there's a lot of jungle, so it's the only stretch going down the Americas you can't cycle across. So typically people from Colón or somewhere in Panama, maybe Panama City, just jump across into Colombia and carry on. But because of the Colombia concerns, I fought and my corner and tried to get access to carry on through Colombia, which BBC High Risk just would not allow. And considering they were paying the bills for that project, I had no comeback. If it had been the Around the World, my first trip, where I had independent sponsors and they were just filming it, I could have stuck my ground. So my greatest regret on the Americas ride was that I didn't get to cycle through Colombia, which is, such a mecca for cycling. It's beautiful, and it's meant to be a wonderfully welcoming place to ride your bike. But I ended up going through the Panama Canal on a Russian banana boat and doing a journey through the Pacific for 48 hours and getting dropped off in Guayaquil, which is a city on the west coast of Ecuador, and then carrying up into the Andes down to Peru, through the Atacama Desert, and then over the Mendoza Pass to get to Argentina and the second climb.
To what extent was that America's trip planned in advance? How much of it was you just working out where to go from day to day?
Most of it was planned. I would say that it wasn't as rigorous as the Around the World, because there was no rules to it. I was just roughly trying to stick to the mountains and get between them in time. But I had a production team back at the BBC. So, there was a level of cost with what they were doing and complexity, which I never had with the Around the World. So whilst I was a bit more careful with my first Around the World, because if I didn't get the rules of the Guinness World Record correct, I would not get the record. The Americas project was a much bigger production in terms of BBC's involvement. So I could change the plan and, be a bit more sort of freestyling in terms of, I'm going to take a day off because I've met an interesting person or whatever it was. So on the production side, a lot more thinking and a lot more investment, but on my side, a lot more freedom to, do what I wanted on route.
You subsequently did the Africa journey, and then more recently you've done the Around the World in 78 days, not 80 days. Have you got plans for future trips similar to those, or other kind of trips?
Not on that scale. So I I've obviously pedaled around the planet a couple of times, and top to bottom, and the length of the African continent. I've got 2 young daughters, so I've sort of committed to not doing any of those big, continent-wide journeys for the time being. But I still want to get my fix of adventure. I'm very passionate about filmmaking, about sharing these stories, and trying to, yeah, I've always tried to do journeys which, first and foremost, they interest me. They've got there's a reason to them, and then capturing them. So, for example, I'm just back from Chile, where we were trying to free ride the world's highest volcano. So the second highest mountain in South America, just shy of what Aconcagua is called Ojos del Salado. It's Chile's highest mountain, and it's a volcano. So 6,893 meters. And, the idea of getting to the top is a tough old climb with bikes on our back and then free riding nigh on 7 kilometers all the way to the Pacific through the Atacama Desert. That was a really fascinating month, really tricky expedition, and very much a first. So I guess my point is, since I've come back from my second round the world, my passion to do other mega distance rides where I'm out there for months on end is lessened, because I kind of feel that was my Everest. I can't get any bigger than that. But what I'd like to do is to continue to take on journeys which first and foremost interest me. So they don't have to be mega distances, but they've got to be, a different challenge. I've always been fascinated in the history of cycling. So last year I made a couple of films about, one was about the oldest British cycling record, which was the penny farthing hour record set in 1886. And one was about the very first Tour de France, which was 1903. So totally different films. One, you've got me, pedaling around on a 54-inch penny farthing, trying to relive the history and understand where this all started. And, the next, I'm, cycling through France, doing a 300-mile stage from Paris to Lyon on a bike from 120 years ago in a flat cap and tweeds.
If you were to look back on all that stuff that you've done, which is, from the perspective of most cyclists, is really worthy and phenomenal stuff in terms of the achievement, the physical achievement, but also the mental achievement of actually putting your mind to doing these things and getting on with them, and crucially getting them done.
Yeah.
If you were to go back right to the beginning and think, right, what advice would I give to myself, perhaps before I set off in 2007, or even, to your younger self before you did much cycling at all, what would it be?
I think because I didn't come from a club background or a racing background, I never saw myself as, particularly competitive. I'm 6'3" and 90 kilos. So I lacked that confidence to back myself and think I could, I even now, because I'm a big rider and because I've always shied away from competition, I've definitely got sort of fundamental insecurities about my ability as a bike rider, which sounds ridiculous, having, been around the world twice and broken all these records and the rest of it. But I've just had such a different approach over the years. I'm a homeschooled boy who has spent a lot of my life doing endurance cycling on my own and pushing myself. So I mean, I guess I would encourage my younger self, my teenage self, to have a bit more confidence in his own ability, to maybe get out there and learn from others, to have, to have a coach, to have a reference point, to have people you could learn from, because I've done almost everything in my career in isolation, for sure, with the support of my family and the rest of it. But I've not grown up sort of in a cycling culture. I've kind of just done it my way. And I think that's had strengths, but it's also had weaknesses in terms of, I've come to the performance side of cycling very late in my career, bringing people in who are really top of their game to be able to improve what I do.
Thank you for everything that you've just said, everything that you said in the last 3/4 of an hour. So I think it's fascinating talking to you. I think it's, I've been following your progress really since I first came up with the crazy idea of cycling to southern Italy back in 2008. And just as I was beginning to think about that, lo and behold, you appeared on the TV with your documentary about cycling around the world. So, you've certainly been very influential in what I've done over the course of the last 10 years. So thank you for that, and thank you for speaking on today's podcast. I do have one last question, however, and that is,
sure.
Are you English or are you Scottish?
Very much both. I've lived my entire life in Scotland. So my mum's Scottish, my dad's English. I was born down south, but depends which newspaper you read. My successes are claimed as both Scottish and British, but yeah, I'm both.
Well, the reason I ask is that I was reading your Wikipedia page earlier, and on the right-hand side, underneath your picture, it says that you were born on the 1st of January 1983 in Swindon, and then when it says personal life, it says that you were born in Blairgowrie in Perthshire. So I always think
I don't know who writes people's Wikipedia pages. I don't think I've ever looked at my own Wikipedia page. Maybe I should, but I should check it's correct for sure, because it sounds like there's a few things that contradict each other. But no, that is correct. I was born in Swindon, although I don't know the place because I moved away when I was weeks old. And I've lived my life in Scotland. But my father's from sort of Coventry way.
Yeah, well, certainly I always think of you as a Scotsman. So on that score, I was just Swindon. You don't strike me as somebody from Swindon. Thank you for joining the podcast, and good luck with your future adventures.
Thank you very much. Great to chat. We've communicated over the years, but great to actually put aside the time to have a proper conversation. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. And I shall hopefully see you when you come to Tadcaster, whenever that talk is rearranged for some point in the future.
We'll definitely make that happen. I'll see you there.
Excellent, thank you.
Even the British ambassador has turned out with the press to witness the climax.
There's the Ark. I'm back.
195 days from Paris to Paris. 18,400 miles on the road. Over 1,500 hours in the saddle. He's climbed the equivalent of 15 Mount Everests, burnt 1.2 million calories, 10 million pedal turns, 27 million heartbeats for one new world record.
Right in. So good. Job done. Job done.
Job done. 5 days later, the new Guinness World Record is confirmed. 3 years in the making, Mark's dream has finally come true.
It's been an incredible adventure. Adventures like this are definitely pretty addictive. There's moments on the road when you wonder, what am I doing? And you kind of kid yourself that you're going to come back and just fit back into normal life. But the seeds of other ideas are already there. You can't really stop that. And I'm already dreaming of other things.